So, Ruben.
Welcome to the Republic of Middle-Aged Men, finally, for this week. I'm your host, Tim, and I'm joined, as usual, by Lachlan.
Howdy.
And Ruben.
G'day.
So, deja vu. We already did this 2 nights ago, and I stuffed up the audio recording, as per our 15-second clip from a couple of days ago. So, do you guys feel well prepared for tonight?
Oh, mate, this is just a tribute. You remember that old Tenacious D song?
Sure
this
do.
is just a tribute to the greatest song ever told. Well, this is just a tribute to the greatest podcast episode ever recorded.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're 100% correct. It was the greatest podcast ever recorded. That was then not recorded. So, Father's Day was on Sunday. How did you go, Ruben?
Oh yeah, good. I got a bunch of wine, and we sort of celebrated the week before because my wife was at work. But that's what I'm drinking tonight. I've got a Margaret River Cabernet Merlot, which is not what I was drinking on Sunday. That one's all gone.
How about you, Lachlan?
Yeah, I had an awesome Father's Day. Got to sleep in, which never happens. And pretty much spent the day eating. So kicked off with a bacon egg roll and a coffee. Hadn't had one of those, bacon egg roll anyway, for months. My wife had prepared like a nice sort of platter of like antipasto and cheeses and all that sort of thing for lunch. And then we had like a Japanese banquet for dinner. So like I literally did nothing but eat all day, which was spectacular.
Glorious. What did I do? I did get a little sleep in. I got waffles with ice cream for breakfast, which was really good. And we had my favourite lunch, which is a platter. So we'll do like cooked chorizo with goat's cheese on top and heated up olives cooked in the chorizo fat, as well as some chili and different sliced meats. Like there's some wagyu that you can get. It's like a beautiful thin piece of smoked wagyu. So good. So yeah, that was really good. Obviously I got my Lego spaceship a few weeks ago, which is finished. So yeah, it's pretty good. Ruben, you said what you were drinking. What are you drinking tonight, Lachlan?
Yeah, actually, funny enough, it's a gin and tonic. Surprise, surprise. It's actually one I got for Father's Day as well. From my mother-in-law, and it was it sort of had, I think, was it notes of Darjeeling tea and citrus or something. But yeah, it's quite pleasant. I'm enjoying that.
Darjeeling tea.
That's it.
Well, on Sunday night, I had conformed and tried gin. I tried gin and tonic on the Saturday, and I didn't rate the tonic, so I went for lemonade, and that was okay. But for tonight, I'm just going to have whiskey out of my hip flask, because why not?
Nice. But why not?
What that contains is a Japanese whiskey.
Of course.
But I don't recall which one. But it's good, so who cares?
How do you get the ice
through the podcast, buddy?
It's not full, and it certainly won't be empty, so that's okay. It is a school night after all.
It is indeed. Yep.
All right, well, let's do a quick recap of where we were up to last episode, and then we can jump into where we're up to now.
Yeah, I think last time we got through music, essentially, and literature, and we kind of got to the tail end of that, and then it got a little bit weird towards the end before the conclusion. The conclusion was essentially that the object of education is to teach us to love what is beautiful. But immediately prior to that, there was some things about different types of, let's say, love of different members of society. I don't quite know how to put that. But Lachlan did a good job of summing that up because he did a bit of extra research. Essentially, we ran into this part of the book where my translation diverged pretty significantly from theirs. But I think even you boys, when you read that section, found it sort of just hard to... It was just a bit odd.
Yeah.
And then when I read mine, it sort of started to become a little bit clear that there was something else going on there. And then Lachlan did us the honour of the background research to make it all make
Yeah.
sense.
So I reckon we'll hand over to you, Lachlan. You can give your well
Yeah,
researched explanation.
yeah, sure. Look, we might just. I think there's just an excerpt. We might just read it from there, so you know what we're sort of talking about.
Oh, do you want me to
Oh,
do
yeah,
that
you
bit, and
read
then you
your
can do
excerpt,
the
and then I'll read
yeah.
my translation so they can hear the
Yeah,
difference.
you go, Tim. And
Okay. Right. So I'll start from here. When a beautiful soul harmonizes with a beautiful form, and the two are cast in one mold, that will be the fairest of sights to him who has an eye to see it. The fairest indeed. And the fairest is also the loveliest. That may be assumed. And the man who has the spirit of harmony will be most in love with the loveliest, but he will not love him who is of an inharmonious soul. That is true, he replied, if the deficiency be in his soul. But if there be any merely bodily defect in another, he will be patient of it and will love all the same. I perceive, I said, that you have or have had experiences of this sort, and I agree. But let me ask you another question. Has excess of pleasure any affinity to temperance?
All right, so hold up there. That's basically where it's a lot different in my in my version, because where you just said that, mine says not if it's a defect in one's character, he replied. If it's a physical defect, he will not let it be a bar to his affection. Then he goes on to say, I know, I said, you've got or once had a boyfriend like that, and I agree with you, but tell me, does excessive pleasure go with self-control and moderation? So they kind of get to the same point, but where it sort of diverges in mine, it actually articulates that particular attraction was to a boyfriend. And as in my understanding of that is there's actually not a boyfriend as in a boy, like a man, like a male friend, but like a boyfriend as in a friend who is a young boy.
Yeah.
So that's sort of what we're kind of getting at, where it differs and where it becomes apparent that there's a different cultural thing going on with this particular section.
yeah,
I found it kind of amusing too, because they're basically saying somebody who has a beautiful mind and a beautiful body is the most beautiful thing, and Socrates is like, and then I think it was Glaucon's like, oh yeah, but you know, an imperfect body is not so important, and Socrates is like, oh yeah, that's right. I remember that kid that you were attracted to. And so
Yeah.
I don't know whether he was like had a gimpy arm or one leg or something like that, but
yeah, it does seem to be throwing a little bit of shade. Um, there's there's one a little bit sort of further on, which I've just read there too, because it's just got some relevance to what we'll talk about. This is kind of like the summary of where they get to. So then I suppose that in the city which we are founding, you would make a law to the effect that a friend should use no other familiarity to his love than a father would use to his son, and then only for a noble purpose. And he must first have the other's consent, and this rule is to limit him in all his intercourse. And he is never to be seen going further, or if he exceeds, he is deemed guilty of coarseness and bad taste. I agree, he said. So, like, from that, I was not quite sure what they were getting on about, which is why I sort of delved in and did a little bit of research from this point, because, you know, it's we just weren't quite sure what the context was. So when I went and sort of dug into it, basically the scenario is that in these times in ancient Greece, it would seem a noble man. I'm not quite sure quite what the context is, but they would basically court a young man who was not yet deemed to be a citizen. So they were definitely really like a pre-teen by the sound of it. And I don't know, kind of, it sounds like they're kind of like taking them under a wing from perhaps, I don't know, some sort of social standing or something like that. But there was definitely a sexual element to it, though, as well. And when they're talking there, and sorry, we were supposed to put the parental warning on at this point in time, which which we did on Sunday, and we just forgot to do that. But right now, you can fast
I can
forward
put that.
2
I'll
minutes
put that
into the
in
future.
Post production, I'll put that in at the start.
Yeah. So in that paragraph I was just reading before, and they're talking about to limit him in all his intercourse. They've actually been quite specific here because there's a thing where basically they were sort of saying that there was like a intercourse but with no penetration was kind of what they were talking about. Sorry, I'll get graphic here for a second, but basically two blokes facing each other and their penis between the thighs or something like that. That seems to be what they're talking about there from some other sort of historical texts that I went and understood. And when they talk about not going on further, there's this thing around, we should point out this is not about homosexuality and heterosexuality, because that was not a thing in Greece. It's about masculinity and femininity. And basically, it's not considered odd back in ancient Greece because they attributed masculinity so long as you were, so to speak, the giver rather than the receiver. And the receiver, because they're a young man who's not yet deemed to be a citizen, it's okay for them to be submissive in that role. But it's not right in their eyes once they become a man, because then they become a citizen and they would be submissive at that point in time. And that's why they're saying that that would be coarse and in bad taste if they were doing that to a fellow man.
Yeah. So do you think that's why they went for the front on front, let the beams cross model? Because they're neither of the taker?
Yeah, but I don't know. I still don't quite look. It sounds like back in ancient Rome, anyway. There's an appreciation for, I suppose, the attractiveness, whether they were male or female, right? But I can't say particularly what that sort of thing was. I mean, look, obviously, people hooked up at much younger ages back in those times, but obviously to our modern sensibilities, it doesn't align. But anyway, look, we understand that it's 2,500 years ago, so that's just what the situation was back then. So
yeah,
there we go.
Yeah, So for those listening or watching, like, we didn't want to brush over this because we want to be intellectually honest. We certainly don't endorse it, but we had to, call it out, and partly because, like, when you read the translation that Lachlan and I have, it's actually so vague that you kind of don't really know what they're talking about, and I think that's just people being courteous or, trying to translate it as gracefully as possible to not be offensive. But
and look, to be honest, when I read through it the first time, like I had put a question mark next to it just because I was just like, what are they getting at here? And then Ruben's version of the text was much more straightforward in its translation, I think, and we're like, oh, okay, that's why I want to dig into it and understand it, because it didn't fit in with what I understood at that point in time. So anyway, covered.
Yes. So I think from there they move on to, because they've done literature and music, and then they move on to physical education, which is one of the shorter sections, but it also has a fair bit of depth in it too. So I think they start out by saying, well, what kind of physical training should a soldier have? And they say, well, wouldn't we want an athlete? And Socrates is like, well, not exactly, because athletes is a very specialized type of training. And he said, haven't you noticed that, well, in my translation, is have you noticed that athletes in training are sleepy creatures, and his health is delicately balanced? The implication being that they're very regimented. They're training for one very specific thing, and that's probably not going to be helpful for soldiers.
Yeah, for sure. From a really practical sense, if you're marching soldiers all over the country to do war with your neighbours or whatever it's going to be, they've got to be a bit more flexible. And I think he's just getting at that fact that, they may have to operate on less sleep. They may have to operate on different water and different foods or what have you. So they can't be on this.
Yeah, that's right. They tie it in with the type of food they eat. It wouldn't really be appropriate for the Guardians to be having fancy food and things like that, because Because when it comes down to it, and they're out in the field, the only thing they're going to be able to do is eat simple foods. So they should be used to that, so that when they end out in the field, it's not a disadvantage. It seems
Yeah,
pretty
and
reasonable.
yeah, and he like compared that to the stories of Homer, and I think they're talking about only eating roast meats or something like that. And
It's something you don't need pots and pans for, basically.
yeah, which makes loads of sense just from a practical perspective. But I
That
think the
actually
thing
makes me
that
think of Lord of the Rings, by the way.
why is
Why
that?
is that?
Because the hobbits, when they first leave the Shire, they take all their
They're
pots and pans and
carrying
stuff.
pots and pans and
Yeah.
stuff.
And I think they lose them at some stage. I think it's like Salmon's up whacking goblins with his pans or something when they're in the mines of Moria. But after that, I think I think he hangs on to them all the way through to when they see the elephants. But the others lose their stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, random way my
Well, I
mum
thought
works. There you go.
it was a pretty amusing section because they go on, they're talking about food, and then they go on to say, Athenian confectionery wouldn't be appropriate. But then for some reason, they just threw in they shouldn't have Corinthian girlfriends.
Yeah,
There was another section where I was like, let's go with these Corinthian girls, hey? But Lachlan was saying he looked it up, and it was basically a meant prostitute.
yeah. So when Corinthia was apparently the sort of the city where brothels were invented by the sound of it. So
Aren't they also known for like really good glass work?
oh yeah, well, no, it was like Corinthian doors was the thing, wasn't it? I don't know. Maybe I'm
Oh,
I
getting
don't know.
that's a
That's
company actually.
That's what I
Is
said.
it? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they sell doors at Bunnings.
Not just for brothels though. Apparently. Oh boy. Sorry, we have no slander against the Corinthian Doors Company.
Yeah, correct.
But yeah, no, it's just really random that they kind of dropped that in, and it was right in the middle of all this sort of food talk. But but it was also seemed kind of funny that they sort of said that they shouldn't hook up with prostitutes when they were just talking about how it's quite all right to find a young man in the village and seduce him to your will or something. So anyway,
Yeah.
interesting times.
Sometimes, yeah.
But I think basically he was sort of saying, with what happens with these guys as far as diet goes, that it should be simple and it should be sort of wholesome. So like where they're talking about the music and all that sort of stuff, the simplicity was best is kind of what they sort of landed on, and so they're trying to do the same
Yeah.
sort of thing.
Just coming back to the Corinth girl thing,
Mm.
my theory is in the middle of their conversation, a Corinthian girl has walked in to the room and distracted the guy that Socrates is talking to. And he's like, "I certainly shouldn't have that.
No.
Bring your attention back here." Because they're not even talking about, they're talking about a fake place. Why would they specifically name Corinthian girls? Like, it's so random. It had to be something weird like that. Like some chick walked in, distracted him, and Socrates has cracked it because he's like, "You're not even listening to me."
In fairness, I mean, maybe it was just a commonly sort of held thing that soldiers, when they're campaigning, would go looking for Corinthian girls, which makes sense, right? Because that's kind of a staple for armies through the sands of time, right? So that could well be maybe why they sort of raised that. And going back to some of their discussion that they actually had in that last chapter about, passion versus love and all of that sort of thing, they were sort of saying that, but passion was what was it, the matter or something like that. I'm trying to see where that sort of a particular passage was, but in any case, I think they were sort of saying that there's a difference between love versus just infatuation or lust, if you know what I mean. And so he's saying, well, there can only be lust if it's a Corinthian girl rather than love, right? So
that ties it in. Yeah, that works.
Yeah. So I could kind of see that maybe.
That's funny.
They kind of lead on from all of that to talking. That sort of rolls on to health and physicians or doctors and solicitors was kind of the next thing they kind of.
Yeah, he kind of zooms out and starts talking about society more generally. Yeah, and he says, and the prevalence of indiscipline and disease.
Oh, Ruben's had a lag out there.
Lincoln begins to give them, uh, yeah, and he goes to say the lawyers and the medics, or the lawyers and the doctors, give themselves heirs. So he kind of sees
Do
the
you want to
need for lawyers and doctors.
do you want to
Yes, mate.
read that bit again because you lagged out really bad.
Oh, sure, sure.
Yeah.
Um, so he goes, and the prevalence of indiscipline and disease in the community leads to, does it not, the opening of law courts and surgeries in large numbers, and law and medicine begin to give themselves airs, especially when they are taken with great seriousness from even by free men. I thought that was interesting because he's roughly saying if you need a lot of doctors and you need a lot of lawyers, then your society is indisciplined and sick.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I think he's certainly got a bit of a chip on his shoulder. And I did a little bit of research on some of this stuff as well. And apparently, it had some arguments. I think it was. There's been some other sort of instances in Plato's or Socrates' sort of maybe it was Socrates, I think, rather than Plato, who had sort of pointed out that maybe they're being doctors being held in too high an esteem, and that um, you know maybe it should be people like himself who should be held in a little bit more higher statue. So I think it was kind of a bit of a battle of who is more important. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah,
so
and
he's
I
got a bit
think
of a chip on his
also,
shoulder about it.
I think contextually too, this is sort of once again this is through Plato's lens, but
Yeah.
a lot of the people back at that time were seen as sophists or people that just cared about influence and what you could get away with rather than the truth. So I can only assume that when Socrates is having a go at doctors and lawyers at that point, he's essentially referring to those sophistic type personalities.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, I think like he certainly has a pretty strong crack at the at the lawyers and what have you, and he's basically saying that anybody who takes pride in finding loopholes in the law to weasel out of convictions as a professional litigant is the most disgraceful thing.
Yeah,
Is the words he used. So he's got a pretty low view there. Um,
That's
but
pretty
yeah,
funny.
look, they do sort of like get back onto I think the diet sort of side of things to sort of say, well, if you've um, got a society who's eating well and all that sort of thing, you just won't need all of those doctors and what have you. And they sort of do roll this into a bit of discussion around more sort of chronic illness versus sort of injury, and I think it's where it starts to get a little interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
so he has a crack at people who don't look after themselves. So basically, he's like, if you don't contribute in any way, you're sick your whole life and you need medicine to survive, you're a burden. And we shouldn't be, getting doctors to treat you. And I think he makes reference to some person who's a soldier or something like that, basically saying that, if they get a wound, they treat it in the moment and then they have to push on. And then I think they move on to like the equivalent of tradies and talk about the same sort of thing, where basically they can't afford to be on their backside for months at a time. So if they do get sick, they get some basic medicine or something to try and help them, and then they just get on with life, and either they get better or they die, and that's their two options.
Yeah,
Is
no,
that
and I
basically
think
yeah,
how
that
you
the thing
remember it?
was when they said they die, it was kind of like, and the problem is solved. Was basically the
Yeah.
yeah.
the
I
way
think
that they put it.
you got to remember the context that he's talking about this ideal society, and they've come to this conclusion that you got one job and you do it well.
Hmm.
And essentially, his position is if you're not doing your job well, you're not contributing to society. Therefore, you become a burden, and you don't really play a role in my perfect society, which is sort of, I think, kind of his mindset. But
I think there's that,
because
and it,
because you can sort of look at it and it's very different from our approach these days to medicine.
hmm.
Um, because he's basically saying, yeah, if someone's at a point where they can't fulfill their job or their duty, then you may as well let them die. Which is almost sort of leaning more towards the eugenics end of the scale.
Yeah, I think it's also too sort of reflective of what your occupation was at that time as well, because it's not like today where you could sort of potentially switch vocations, 4 or 5 times in your lifetime. And I think it was that thing that you're sort of born into an apprenticeship almost, and you sort of do this particular job from the day you're born to the day you die almost. And if you're deprived of your occupation, it's kind of part of your identity. I mean,
Yeah,
you would be the butcher, you would be the fishmonger, or whatever it's going to be, and
yeah.
that
He
job would
refers to
be.
that kind of prolonged. He refers to that kind of prolonged illness.
Hmm.
He says that it can only lead to an unhappy prolongation of life and the
Yeah.
production of children as unhealthy as themselves. So that's kind of the bit where I'm just like, yeah, this is sounding very, this is sounding very 1930s Germany to me.
Yeah, I
Well,
mean, he
well, to
cites
be
that.
fair, Hitler did use Caesar's playbook quite a lot. Um,
Yeah,
but
Yeah, even
Sparta
the
was a thing back in
iconography
too,
is
right?
very similar.
Yeah, but Sparta was a thing back in this period of time, and they were very big on if there's any defects, burn them all. But like even
yeah.
that idea is so offensive to us. We're watching a movie earlier this week, Greenland, with Gerald Butler, and one of the things in
Oh,
the
I saw the
oh,
trailer for that and the write up, and I'm just like, nah, I'm out.
it's actually not
You
that bad.
actually,
It's actually
it's
not that
not.
bad. Yeah, I'm going to do a
Yeah,
spoiler. So spoiler alert if people care. Um, his kid has
and you shouldn't.
diabetes, and they're all cleared to go there, but the government missed that the kid had diabetes. So when they get at the gate of the place to escape from the world ending, they get refused because the kid has diabetes. And I was like, oh, that's very Greek of them. After reading this book, so yeah, there you go. And I was like, it was so offensive. I'm like, how dare they? How dare they do that?
Yeah, a bit different time then. I look, they're interesting in the story. Like they referred to Asclepius as well, who's sort of the god of medicine in Greek mythology. And it's getting onto Rubes' point there that he'd treat a wound, but would not treat a lifelong ailment. So there was a bit of a quote there, which I think Rubes was referring to before, saying he did not want to lengthen our good-for-nothing lives or to have weak fathers begetting weaker sons. If a man was not able to live in the ordinary way, he had no business to cure him, for such a cure would be of no use whether to himself or the state. So they're
Yeah,
pretty clear in their sentiment there.
I think part of it is his mindset is that the state, and we don't know because we haven't got through to the end of the book, and we still haven't really even figured out what justice is. But so far, I think basically his highest order value is the health of the state.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Um, and obviously that's now that from reading this you can see that's a very old idea, but it's an idea that comes back, and it's come back in the last 50 to 100 years.
Hmm.
It's a terrifying effect.
are you,
Yep.
are you referring to the nation of Winnie the Pooh?
Oh, I don't know. I wasn't so much thinking of China. I was thinking more Germany, and then communist countries where the state is God.
Yep, fair enough.
Hmm.
All right.
So after all of that, sort of Glaucon really agrees with all of that, above attitude. But mind you, he does sort of flip it around a little bit and say, well, at the end of the day, if we've got a perfect state, you're still going to need doctors, right? You can't just write them all off.
Yeah,
And then Socrates sort of agrees that, yes, okay, we should have some good doctors and good judges in their state, but who is good? And they start to talk about the how to select a judge for their perfect state as well, which is interesting. Well, I think they compare
Yeah,
first of all, right? That there's two different methodologies because a doctor you would have a different selection to the judge, right?
mm.
yeah. So the doctor was more. You need someone who's been sick many times to be a doctor.
or at least exposed to all
Yeah.
types of diseases.
So
But they
then
said
they
that's not
know
the
how to
case with
treat it.
judges.
Yeah. So do you want to expand on that a bit, Ruben?
I don't think I can.
I think
Well,
it
I'm
was
happy to
more
have a
along the
crack.
lines, I think, of like they could be sick of body because that way they could be healing themselves and basically practicing on doctoring themselves so they get better at their technique, right? As long as they're strong of good sound mind, because if you're sick in mind as well as sick in body, then you're no good for anything. So
Yeah, that's right. 'Cause he basically characterizes it as a doctor is using his mind to
yeah,
control the body, whereas a judge is
that's
to
right.
use his mind to control the mind.
Mm,
Yeah.
that's right. So when they start talking about the judges selection process was a bit different. So they're talking about you know um, the difference between their sort of backgrounds and where they would start. So they more
Yeah.
or less sort of land on the fact that a judge should be a person who was born with a good soul and a good person by nature, but who has been screwed over and taken advantage of for years and years and years, and so has gained the experience of what it is to be sort of um, you know had wrong done to them, so that they could identify that in people, but could still see the good in people. So that they basically sort of said it needs to be an old man who's always been good, but has gotten this experience through life and is now sort of wise and can make these decisions.
Yeah.
Um,
So he's basically not corrupted, but he understands the impact that the corruption has on those who aren't.
Yeah, and he even says that people who are good in their youth appear naive,
mm, mm,
um, which is interesting. I think there's some truth to that.
Hmm.
yep, I think so too.
Yeah.
And I think that on the flip side of that, he was sort of saying, if they had been someone who's done wrong, so that they have experienced all the wrongness that can sort of exist, but are now a good judge or what have you, because they can identify all of that wrongness, would be too cynical because they would expect everyone to be out there trying to rip off the system and all that sort of thing. So wouldn't actually be able to recognize a good man because they've never been a good man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So I think that's what they were saying. The difference was that a good person could still see the wrong and understand the good, whereas someone who's been wrong, who's become good,
Yeah.
probably wouldn't recognize the good.
Yeah.
So I
That
think the
that's
quote was that you cannot recognize an honest man because he has no pattern of honesty in himself.
yeah.
that's it.
That
That's the
that
way to put it.
that's I remember talking about that last time when our recording failed, and
Yeah.
pointing out that uh, Peterson, who I listen to a lot, basically talks about that there's three approaches to life. That you've got naively optimistic, or pessimistic, or knowingly optimistic, and that the third was the best choice. Because if you're naively optimist, you're going to get hit by a train. If you're a pessimist, you've been hit by the train, but there's no joy in you. Or you can choose to be optimistic, even though you know that at times that won't work well, or that you'll get a bad result, and that's the
Yeah,
most courageous way to be. And I
set
think
your
he's right.
attitude to gratitude.
Yeah, correct.
So after all that, they basically wrap up. There's a couple of quotes that kind of summarize that sort of section up. So I'll just go through those quickly.
Yeah, sure.
So this is the sort of medicine and this is the sort of law which you will sanction in your state. They will minister to better natures, giving health both of soul and body. But those who are diseased in their bodies, they will leave to die. And the corrupt and incurable souls, they will put an end to themselves. And following on from
They'll
that,
put an end to themselves.
absolutely, just finish the
Wow.
job. Thank you.
Here's your own
Um,
sword. Mind that first step.
yeah, that's it. That's it. And there's a couple more. And thus our youth, having been educated only in that simple music, which, as we said, inspires temperance, will be reluctant to go to law. And the musician who, keeping to the same track, is content to practice the simple gymnastic, will have nothing to do with medicine unless in some extreme case. So, really talking down on, encouraging anyone to go to law and medicine there. But,
Yeah.
but anyway, they've sort of put a bow on that so that sort of section gets wrapped up, so to speak.
Yeah, nice.
They really move on now to kind of talk about the the balance that they should be seeking between gymnastic or the physical pursuits and the arts. So literature and music.
Yeah, that was an interesting bit. Like he sort of roughly says, if you're too interested in just the life of the mind, you become soft, and if you're just too interested in the life of the body, so to speak, you basically become kind of like a barbarian. I like the terminology in my book is quite good. He says for the person that's just interested in physical training and doesn't cultivate the mind, he says, and so he becomes unintelligent and an unintelligent philistine and no use for reasoned discussion, and an animal addicted to settling everything with brute force. His life is one of clumsy ignorance, unrelieved by grace or beauty. And I'm like,
That's beautiful.
that's a really beautiful way to describe a jock.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's just jocks versus nerds, and it's you
A
know.
Philistine.
Well, I thought that was interesting because Philistine is Philistine in your translation?
I
Because
don't recall it. Yeah.
that doesn't
I'll
make
have a
sense
look.
for it to be in here in my mind, and like I'm total amateur when it comes to history, but I mean Philistine makes sense to anyone that's read the Bible, right? Like that's a term that makes sense. But I don't know whether Socrates had access to the Bible. I mean, maybe he did, um, but that doesn't mean he didn't know what Philistines were. But I'm wondering if it's more whoever's translated my version has uh, used it so that people in our time can understand the term more. So don't get too
Mm.
hung up on it, guys. It's just a little side note because I'm a big fan. I
Yeah.
love the term Philistine.
I haven't noticed it in my translation. I don't recall it being there.
Yeah,
I wish I could find it, but no, I cannot.
an animal addicted to settle everything by brute force.
Mm. Oh, here we go. And he ends becoming a hater of philosophy, uncivilized, never using the weapon of persuasion. He is like a wild beast, all violence and fierceness, and knows no other way of dealing. And he lives in all ignorance and evil conditions, and has no sense of propriety and grace. So that's
I
our
think I
version.
like your versions better. Like I'm more and more finding the language is just a little bit more poetic than mine. Mine's a little bit more analytical.
Yeah, we're more flowery.
Yeah. If you're going to read something old, you want it to be poetic, right?
Sure, absolutely.
Who knew the Mount Druitt edition would be the poetic one? Maybe they're expecting the people like to read it out to a hip hop tune or something.
Yeah, that's it.
Oh, dude, that
Bust
would
some
be amazing.
Socrates on you.
If we could ever get the funding, we'll do a hip hop rendition, like a stage musical hip hop version of Plato's Republic. That would be the most amazing thing ever.
Oh,
Socrates, dude.
we'd have to get like Vanilla Ice to play Socrates when he's in his 60s. That'd be awesome.
Gentlemen, stop, collaborate, and listen.
Oh, you did it.
Bang.
He was a
Well,
philosopher. Didn't even know it. But basically, after all that argument, anyway, these guys basically agree that you need to strike the perfect balance between the gymnastic and the artistic sort of side to have the best situation for the guardians to flourish. So they want them to have enough brawn to be able to beat them back, but have the intelligence to know when they should talk and be perhaps more delicate in their negotiations. So
Yep.
I think
Yeah.
that's more or less what
Tame
they're
the
sort of
beast.
finishing up with at the end there. So there's a little quote. And he who mingles music with gymnastic in the fairest proportions and best attempers them to the soul may be rightly called the true musician and harmonist in a far higher sense than the tuner of the strings. There's that flowery poetry for you, Ruse, just to finish it up.
Yeah, my version is that the last like line of your translation for that bit?
Pretty close to, yeah.
Yeah, because mine is we must therefore ensure, my dear Glaucon, as I said, that there is always someone like this in charge of education in our state. It is if its constitution is to be preserved. Which,
Mhm.
yeah, nice big words, bruh, but where's the poetry at? But I mean, you do. It kind of does give you sort of differing perspectives, because when I've read the sort of the conclusion of that chapter, I've written my own little summary, which is
Mm.
essentially the survival of the state requires the populace to have a certain character. Socrates is convinced that this character can be achieved through education. Therefore, education must be monitored by a person with a certain character. Um,
Yep,
I think that's kind of roughly where he's at.
Yeah,
I'd
makes
agree.
sense.
Yep,
Yep.
yep. Look, we have
Awesome.
a similar line, and such a presiding genius will always be required in our state if the government is to last. Is what we have to
See, that
say.
still sounds nicer.
And really, that's it for gymnastics. So I think maybe we'll park that one there because we get into some juicy stuff as that book 3 sort of wraps up. But we might save that one for next week or later on
Yeah,
this
right
week.
on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. Well, it is next week. It's Sundays that we film, so we're still
Yeah, true.
in that window. Just all right. Well, let's take a stroll down through to the pub Philosophus as we insert a jingle here, um, which I still haven't made. Oh, listen to that! He's ready to go. Wow!
It's the
I
best
just
we
need to
can
put
do
some
so
guitar
far.
over it.
Loot. It's
So
gotta be loot.
yes,
No,
so
no loot and no flute in this society, right?
I have a banjolina.
A
I don't
what?
know what that is.
It's kind of like a banjo.
Oh, I thought
It's
that
my
was when
wife's.
Brad and Angelina were together. Was it
Yeah,
Brangelina?
No.
yeah. Because it's actually my wife's mum's someone's relative had it, and I found it up in their roof, and I was like, oh, it's going to get destroyed up here. So I brought it down and cleaned it all up and put new strings on it. So I'll make something with that. It's probably like
So
it's
what is
not
it, like
legit the
a
right instrument,
ukulele
but
version of a banjo?
kind of, yeah, yeah. I'll see if I can put a photo of it up on the story in post production.
I think the task for you, Tim, is to look up the sheet music for the intro to Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and to be able to play that on your Brangelina, whatever it's called.
I don't need
Yeah,
to look
get
it up.
working,
I
man.
know it off by
You've
heart.
got till
I'll be able
Sunday.
to just remember it. I'll be able to
You've
remember
got
it.
till
It's
Sunday
fine.
to master that.
Nice. All right. So the topic for the pub philosophers this week is I wanted to discuss a video by a YouTube channel called Academy of Ideas. It's a 10-minute video, and it is titled "Why an Obsession with Safety Creates Sick Minds and a Sick Society." Discuss. No. So I watched this video and was like, wow, this is really nailing some important things for me. I used to do safety as my career. Did it for 9 years and learned heaps of good things through it. But this video addresses some of my experiences in that, but it also addresses at a more personal level issues, because I've had issues before with anxiety, and I had to learn some strategies on how to deal with that. And the strategies of dealing with anxiety and anxiety attacks are counter to the advice that you would probably get from trying to be safe, which tends to be go and expose yourself to it. And Jordan Peterson talks about you've got to go slay that dragon. Go slay the dragon in the cave before it comes and burns down your village. So, I was just like, this is a really, really good video because it's addressing those things that for me personally have been going on, and it's also a good commentary, I think, on where culture in the West is at this particular point in time, where we're more concerned about safety than we are about freedom. So, yeah, that's why I wanted to discuss it a little bit. So I'll pass the microphone over and see what you guys
Well,
think.
for clarification, like the technical term that particular video uses is that it's put safety as a higher order value um, than ordinarily it
over
should be
everything.
or would be. And I think that's a good way to think about it. Is basically, if you're thinking about what is most important, that video is basically saying if you put safety above other things in terms of importance, it's going to have some consequences.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. It's certainly
Hmm.
not anti-safety, but it's saying,
No, it just
what's in
shouldn't
this
be
Safety
picture?
the
can't be
number
your
one
goal.
priority for your society. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
look, here's an example that I know we've discussed before, Lachlan. Um, I love riding motorbikes. I have a motorbike.
Hmm.
My concern is our culture's attitude towards safety. Is at some point in the future, it, I will not be allowed to ride my motorbike anymore because the government will say that is too unsafe, and for your safety, we're going to stop you from being able to do that one day. That might be 200 years away. I don't know when that is, but on the current trajectory, I think that will happen at some stage. Or something else like
Yeah,
we've
like
both
if we
got
get to
really
a
old
point,
cars, you can't use them anymore because they're too unsafe.
yeah, if we get to a point
Totally.
where computerized, everything's automated and cars are computerized and brand new cars are super safe and all that sort of stuff, you're right. It could get to the point where they're sort of like, well, why those risks are just unacceptable now because we have this system that's essentially foolproof. Is that sort of what you
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, I think we were talking about it. Just if you make safety that a higher order, it takes away choice, and as a society, you want to have that choice for yourself around what's acceptable for you. Um, and I like to talk about the cars. My car's got no ABS, no airbags. Um, don't think it's even got a collapsible steering column. So, like, if I have an accident, that chances are it's going to be a pretty serious one. And I know, like Tim, we were talking about the motorbikes, and what the stats are. You very specifically knew exactly
Yeah.
what the stats are for coming off a motorbike.
Yeah, I'll say them now off the top of my head. Last time I checked, it was 3.5 times more likely to die if you have an accident on a motorcycle than in a car, and 27 to 28 times more likely to have a lifelong disability.
Mm.
So it's significantly
But
more higher risk.
yeah, but you wouldn't trade the feeling you get from riding a motorcycle to be more safe, would you?
100%. I feel
Mm.
more alive on that bike than just about anywhere else in the world. It's the best feeling.
Yeah, it does sort of like I hate to keep drawing parallels about cars because obviously that's a passion area, but you know it's almost like every time they bring out a new safety feature for a car, I think, well, there we go, the drivers are going to get dumber again, because it's like people used to know how to brake in their cars, and now you have ABS brakes, and people don't know how to brake in a car that wouldn't have ABS brakes. And I'm not saying we
We've even
shouldn't
got
have
braking
ABS
assist
brakes.
now.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's we're talking about things like automated cruise control and all of these things. And I always think people by nature are lazy, and I think sometimes it's easy for decisions and risk to be taken away from people in the name of safety. Um, and look, I don't know. Like, I must admit, I read a couple of comments that were on this video, and there was some guy in Afghanistan or something like that who said, "I've lived in under a totalitarian government, and strangely, people feel safe under that because the decisions are taken away from them sometimes." And he said, you've got to be careful because it's very easy to fall into that trap where decisions are now being made for you in the scheme of a higher power, and we're looking after you. We're taking that decision away from you to protect you.
Yeah.
And
I think that's a really, really important thing for people to keep in mind. And even that video itself, kind of about halfway through, just sort of hits you with, yeah. And if you value safety too high, it can have this impact. And it's like, and it leads to totalitarianism.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it certainly can, and I think it's just one of those things that like no one's saying that you should make things unsafe
Mm.
just for the fun of it. But I think the video made some really good points that there's been some really amazing things that have happened in human history because people accepted risk
Yep.
and didn't choose the safe option. And if we as a society always take the safe option, how are you going to progress? I know, like, there's something I was keen to talk about on Sunday that I forgot forgot about, but it was like, listening to Elon Musk talking about, going on a mission to Mars and
Yeah.
saying people are probably going to die as we try and do this. This is really risky, but we need to do this.
And it won't be
And
four. Like his ships are getting designed to take between 1 to 300 people at a time.
mm,
Like that's going to be a massive test for that project. If they, let's say, the first 4 flights are successful, and you get 4 to 800 people on Mars, and then the fifth
yep.
flight blows up, what do? Do they stop the mission and leave the 800 there to sort it out, or do
No.
they continue? Like it's a big call.
Mm.
And I hope that they have the balls to see it through, but I'm concerned that they'll get blocked at some point by some government saying, "Nah, the risk is too high."
Yeah, and look, and from a government's perspective, some of that's going to be political risk, right? Not actual risk.
Mm.
I
And
think that's a big problem.
mm,
I think that's a really big problem because I think a lot of decisions are made, even particularly in our society in current days here in Australia. A lot of decisions are made on the basis of political risk and not actual risk.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And I just think I actually think that's dangerous. Without going into too much detail, I think that's downright dangerous.
Yeah.
mm,
So
yeah,
with my background, I think there's two approaches to safety, and I think there's zero harm, and there's reasonable risk. And so, one example I'll give is skydiving. So a zero harm approach to I want to be allowed to jump out of an aeroplane. The zero harm approach would be okay, you can do that, but the aeroplane is 1 foot off the ground because if it goes wrong, you won't die. So no one can die if we let's even do it 1 meter off the ground. No one will die. So that's an acceptable zero harm risk.
mm,
Well, stuff that. I'm not skydiving. But equally, I don't want to go skydiving in some Volkswagen Beetle powered monoplane that some bloke built in his backyard with a
yep,
parachute made out of old tablecloths. Like, I want there to be standards around flying, licensing, good parachutes, all those things. But at the end of the day, if that risk of you jump out of a plane, everything goes wrong, you die, exists, well, as long as that's a 1 in 400,000 event instead of a 1 in 3 event, well, then play on, and
yeah,
that's
acceptable
my
risk.
concern is yes, but that's my concern is people go, well, but what if it's one person that that dies? Well, you've caused that person to die. No, I haven't. Gravity caused that person to die, and they were
Their
they were
decisions.
choosing to do their passion and live the life they wanted to. So, you know, that's one example, and I'll just quickly say the other example was a person that previously trained me used to do risk assessments for paratroopers, and an acceptable risk for a mission behind enemy lines was a 30% fatality rate. So below that
Mm.
was acceptable, above that was unacceptable. And to me, that was like a really significant example of risk management versus zero harm. And that, so, I think if you've got a zero harm mentality as a society, that's this type of safety sickness that this video is talking about, where it prevents you from living and it prevents you from doing anything. But risk management done well, I think, actually emboldens you to take those chances and to do those things because you know that you've given yourself the best chance possible to succeed without killing yourself and killing everyone else. And so I think that's why it's That's what I think. That's what the video is trying to get to, is that sort of distinction, and that we've lost sight of that distinction as a society.
Yeah,
Yeah,
big
what was
time.
the Seneca quote again, Tim? Because I thought that was relevant.
The Well, there's, yeah. So Seneca's one, I think, was just, well, I'll paraphrase. I won't quote it verbatim. It's essentially, just because a man has grey hairs and wrinkles does not mean he has lived long. He has merely existed long.
I think you're pretty close there, but yeah, yeah. It's that difference between what is it to live versus exist, and
Yeah,
you can be captain safety and not experience anything in your life, or God, I know I've done some risky stuff, and I wouldn't take any of them back.
yeah,
I did some really risky skiing in New Zealand when I was sort of 21 or something like that, up on some like black diamond trails and stuff like that, where I
mm,
you know was there's a high chance, I suppose, you could have come a cropper, but it was spectacular and beautiful, and I'd do it again.
100%.
Mm.
Um, yeah. You got anything to add to that, Ruben?
No, not really. I just yeah. Look. I think personal. I think one of you mentioned just now that you could have that perfect safety, or not perfect. You could have that higher level of safety, but it's going to infringe on your freedom, on your personal
Mm.
choice. And I think it's just to a large effect. That's what it comes down to. It's a trade-off between freedom and safety.
Yep.
Yeah,
And look, and as you were pointing out, Tim, there's got to be a balance. But if you place safety as the highest order principle, you're going to run into troubles.
yeah,
And look, perhaps if you place freedom as the highest order principle, then you're probably also going to run into freedom. But it's very easy for those two things to get out of whack. Me personally,
yeah,
I'm more for freedom over safety, and personal responsibility. But that might just be the way I'm wired. I mean, other people will take that freedom route every single time.
Like, personal responsibilities have got a big part to play in there as well, and I think you have to have a society that recognizes it, and doesn't uh, you know
They need that character that Socrates is talking about.
yeah, was that
Yeah,
virtue?
like the ones that they're going to look after themselves, they're going to eat properly, and they're going to work hard. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're not going to need lawyers and doctors. They've got that sense of personal responsibility.
Yeah, well, I mean, you don't want to have that society that's suing everyone for everything when it's just your own dumb fault that something happened.
Yeah, because if you
yeah,
do, you're going to end up with a point. You're going to end up at a point where the government is going to legislate for safety because they don't want everyone suing each other.
Well, I mean, we
yeah,
were going that way for a while there, and I don't know if you remember, there was, God, it was probably in the sort of mid 2000s, and everywhere you went, there's like safety signs everywhere, caution, this, that, and the other, because they're worried that someone's going to trip, slip, fall, whatever, whatever. Um, Fortunately, it seemed to wind back a little bit, and the litigation in the courts started to sort of abate, and some
Yeah,
normality resumed. But we were going in the wrong direction for a while there.
yeah.
Um,
I think part of it was there was some research showing that people would become blind to signs because there'd been so
mm,
many of them, they just weren't paying attention to them anymore.
yep.
Look, the other thing I'll say on this is one of my favourite stories is The Hobbit, followed by Lord of the Rings, and both of those make the same point around those from the Shire. That if they're in the Shire, they're in this safe little world where there's no harm and no risk, and they eat and drink and be merry. But they're vulnerable, and they just don't know they're vulnerable. And the difference between the book and the movies, spoiler alert, is at the end, after they defeat Sauron, and Frodo returns to the Shire. The Shire's been taken over by Saruman and some orcs, and
yeah, that's really interesting, that part.
it is, and they have
And
to
not only is
raise the Shire up and fight them out.
But not only is it that it's taken over by orcs and that, but the orcs have the hobbits doing a lot of the work.
Yep.
So they show up there, and there's all these hobbits who have just like jumped on that safety bandwagon, and they're just like ratting each other out and stuff. And that's like another battle that they've kind of the mindset, because, and I think that's what you're saying, Tim. Like they lived in this like cushioned, decadent kind of lifestyle. So when it came to taking risk, they were just they weren't willing to do it, and it led to them just being tyrannized.
That's right. And so when you, and I think it was a real shame the movies didn't touch this, because it touches on that bigger idea again that I've heard Peterson talk about, which is a rabbit isn't virtuous. And what he means by that is a rabbit is cute and nice and it doesn't hurt anything, but that doesn't make it virtuous. It just makes it a prey animal. But if you're a monster who can destroy and can fight and can do all these things, but then you do not act monstrously, that makes you virtuous. And that is what Frodo and Sam and all those guys become. You know?
Well, yeah, that's right. C.S. Lewis kind of touches on that sort of stuff too, but from the inverse. Like, he talks about courage, and he's like, it's not courage if there's no risk.
Yes.
You can't live a courageous, like, and all those things that we call virtuous unless there's some risk. Then you don't get to exercise courage, and they have no value. That's a really simplified version of it. I'm probably getting it wrong, but
no, but I mean, it's people who are awarded the Victoria Cross for bravery in battle, they've put themselves into a high risk situation where they're probably going to die, but they're doing it for the greater good and the benefit of their fellow man. And that's where heroes are born. And what would be the world without heroes? It takes one to stand up to tyranny sometimes. If you don't have people who are willing to take that risk, you're setting yourself up for failure there. So,
yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. So, I think that pretty much covers how I feel about that topic, I think. Thanks for talking it through with me, guys. So,
pleasure.
Well, it wasn't as good as the first run at it, but it was all right.
I'm picturing us in a pay for the recording booth.
Just
that was such a good clip of Jack Black. That was so good.
Yeah, I'm going to watch that after we get off here.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So for those listening or watching, I'll put the link to that Academy of Ideas video into the description for this episode.
They all like crack.
And check out their channel. Yeah.
Yeah. I've been watching so many of those. It's just like distilled knowledge from the last 100 years, basically.
It's a very good channel. I highly recommend it. Excellent quotes, excellent logic applied to different subjects, and doesn't seem to be overly extreme in any political direction. It's quite neutral. Well, what I perceive to be as neutral. And every political compass thing I've ever done, I'm always just slightly right of centre. Even though a lot of people expect me to be further to the right, I end up always being less than 1 unit of measure from the centre. So it can't be that bad. So look, thanks for joining us for round 2 tonight, Ruben and Lachlan, and I'm very confident that it worked this time. And for the listeners, thanks for your patience with this episode coming out a bit late. And remember, the Republic wasn't built in a day, and neither were middle-aged men. So have a good rest of the week, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.
It's been a pleasure, mate.
Okay, I've just done that to sync